If she hadn't slept with him in our barn, I never would have become the face of a statewide farming cooperative. That's the kind of twist you don't see coming, isn't it? 1 minute, your life is rolling along like a tractor on a familiar field, steady and predictable. The next, it's flipped upside down, and somehow, you end up better off than you ever imagined. But let me start at the beginning, because that's the only way this makes sense. My name's Owen Rourke, and I'm a farmer in rural Montana. This is my story, how a betrayal I never asked for turned into something I never expected. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent my whole life on this land. It's a third-generation farm, passed down from my granddad to my dad, and then to me. We focus on sustainable produce and livestock, nothing fancy, just good, honest work. The farm's not just a job, it's who I am. I wake up before the sun, check the animals, tend the fields, and keep everything running. It's a routine I've always loved, even when it's tough. My dad used to say a man's worth is in his loyalty to his family, his land, his promises. I've lived by that, always have. Then there's my wife, Lena. She's 36, and we've been married for 10 years. When we met, she was all about the farm life. She grew up in a small town not far from here and thought living out here was romantic, like something out of a storybook. She'd talk about the quiet, the fresh air, the way the stars looked at night. I believed her. For a while, it seemed like we were building something together. We'd work side by side, laugh over little things, and sit on the porch after a long day, just listening to the crickets. I thought we were solid. But looking back, I can see the cracks forming. Lena's got a restless side to her, always has. She's charming, the kind of person who lights up a room, but she's not one for sitting still. The farm's isolation started to get to her, I guess. The winters are long out here, and the days can feel endless when you're stuck in the same routine. She never said it outright, but I could tell she was itching for something more, something I couldn't give her. I'd catch her staring out the window sometimes, like she was looking for a way out. I didn't know what to do about it, so I just kept going, hoping she'd settle back into our life. Then this guy, Troy Benson, came along. I didn't know his name at first, just that he was some marketing consultant who showed up one day. He's 39, I found out later, and we went to high school together, though we weren't buddies back then. He'd gone off to college, made a name for himself, and came back to the area as a regional agri-marketing consultant. Fancy way of saying he helps farms like mine sell their stuff better. He stopped by a while back for what he called a local supplier spotlight video shoot. Said it'd be good exposure for us, maybe bring in some new buyers. I figured, why not? A little boost couldn't hurt. That first day, he stayed longer than he needed to. I was out in the fields, but when I came back, I saw him chatting with Lena near the barn. She was laughing, really laughing, in a way I hadn't heard in a while. He's got a smooth way of talking, I'll give him that. Made her smile like I used to. I didn't think much of it then, just figured he was being friendly. But he kept coming back. Every couple of weeks, he'd show up with some new idea, tweaking the video, pitching a marketing plan. Each time, he'd linger, and Lena seemed to perk up around him. I'd watch from the porch sometimes, feeling this knot in my gut, but I didn't say anything. I trusted her. That's what you do when you love someone, right? Things started shifting after that. Lena got fussier about how she looked. She'd put on makeup just to run into town, spend extra time picking out clothes even for chores. She'd make excuses to stay behind when I was working the outer fields, saying she had things to finish up in the barn or the house. I'd nod and head out, telling myself it was nothing. But that knot in my stomach kept getting tighter. One evening, something felt off. I'd been out fixing a fence, and when I got back, the horses were acting strange, pacing, snorting, like something had spooked them. I checked the barn, but it was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. We've got a few security cameras around the property, mostly for the animals, in case of coyotes or trespassers. I don't usually bother with them, but that night, I pulled up the footage. The barn camera showed 20 seconds of blurred movement, just enough to know someone had been there, but not enough to see who or what. My heart started pounding, but I didn't say a word to Lena. She was in the kitchen, humming like nothing was wrong. I just sat there, staring at the screen, wondering what I'd missed. That's when I decided to do something I never thought I'd have to. I ordered a second trail camera, small, hidden, not hooked up to the Wi-Fi. Told myself it was just to ease my mind, that I was overthinking it. I set it up in the barn a few days later, tucked away where no one would notice. Lena didn't suspect a thing. I didn't want her to. Whatever was going on, I needed to know for my sake, for the farm's sake, for our marriage's sake. What I found on that camera changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now, all I can tell you is that my life was about to take a turn I never saw coming. I was a farmer, a husband, a man who believed in loyalty above all else. And soon, I'd find out just how far that belief would be tested. Stick with me, because this story's got more twists than a country road, and it's only just beginning. The day I decided to check the hidden camera footage, I felt like everything I'd built over the years might come crashing down around me. I'd installed that camera in the barn a week earlier, driven by a nagging suspicion I couldn't shake. Something about Lena's late nights and vague excuses had started to gnaw at me. Sitting in my office that evening, a cramped room just off the kitchen, I fired up the laptop and pulled up the recordings. My hands didn't tremble, but my chest felt tight, like I couldn't quite get enough air. I'd always been a man who faced problems head-on, whether it was a broken fence or a failing crop, and this was no different. I had to know the truth, even if it ripped my world apart. With a slow exhale, I clicked the play button and watched the screen flicker to life. The footage started innocently enough, showing the barn's interior as it always was, the horses dozing in their stalls, the faint rustle of straw under their hooves. I fast-forwarded through hours of nothing, my eyes scanning for anything out of place. Then, about halfway through the recording, the barn door swung open. Lena stepped inside, her movements quick and cautious, her head turning to glance back toward the house. My stomach twisted into a knot. Moments later, Troy Benson slipped in behind her, easing the door shut with a careful hand. They stood close together, closer than they had any reason to be, and then Troy reached out, brushing his fingers across her cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, a soft, private smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Watching them there, in the barn where Lena and I had shared so many quiet moments early in our marriage, felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. What happened next wasn't subtle or uncertain. Troy pulled her toward him, his arms wrapping around her waist, and she pressed herself against him without hesitation. They kissed, a deep, unhurried kiss that spoke of familiarity, of something that had been going on for a while. My hands curled into fists on the desk, but I kept my eyes locked on the screen, forcing myself to take in every detail. They moved toward the hay bale in the corner, the same one Lena and I had sat on years ago, dreaming about the future. Now, she was there with him, their hands fumbling with each other's clothes, their bodies pressed together in a way that left no room for doubt. I didn't stop the video or look away. I watched it all, letting the reality of their betrayal sink into me like water soaking into dry soil. When the footage ended, I didn't get up right away. I sat there in the dim light of the office, staring at the blank screen as the video looped back to the start. My mind felt numb, like it couldn't process what I'd just seen, but my body was tense, every muscle coiled tight. I don't know how long I stayed like that, replaying the images in my head, Lena's smile, Troy's hands, the way they moved together like I didn't exist. Eventually, I shut the laptop and pushed myself to my feet, my legs stiff from sitting too long. I walked into the kitchen, where Lena was standing at the counter, slicing carrots for dinner. She looked up as I entered, her face bright and unbothered. "You're back early tonight," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "How'd it go with the irrigation line?" I nodded, my throat too dry to form words at first. I grabbed a glass from the cupboard and filled it with water, taking a long sip to buy myself time. She kept talking, her voice light and casual, something about the neighbor's new tractor and how the forecast promised rain. I barely heard her. All I could think about was the sound of her breathing in the barn, the way she'd leaned into Troy like he was the only man in the world. "You're awfully quiet," she said after a minute, tilting her head to study me. "Everything all right?" "Yeah, just worn out," I managed to say, setting the glass down and meeting her eyes. For a moment, I thought about telling her I knew, letting it all pour out right there over the cutting board. But I held back, swallowing the words before they could escape. She didn't need to know yet, not until I figured out what I was going to do. I forced my lips into a thin smile and added, "Long day in the fields." She accepted that, turning back to her cooking with a little nod. I stood there a moment longer, watching her move around the kitchen like nothing had changed, like she hadn't just shattered everything we'd built. Then I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face as I started walking. I didn't have a destination, just paced the farm, past the fields I'd plowed every spring, past the barn where it had happened, past the shed where I kept the tools that had kept this place running. My mind raced with questions. How long had it been going on? How many times had they met right under my nose? What had I missed that let this happen? Every step churned up more thoughts, more pieces of the life I'd thought was solid now crumbling in my hands. I didn't go back inside until well after midnight. Lena was asleep by then, the house dark and silent. I couldn't bring myself to climb into bed beside her, so I sank into the armchair on the porch instead, staring out at the land that had defined my life. This farm was mine, ours, I'd thought, and now it felt stained, marked by what they'd done. But sitting there, something hardened inside me, a quiet determination taking shape. I wasn't going to let them ruin me, not without a fight. By morning, as the first light crept over the horizon, I'd made up my mind. I wouldn't confront her yet, I'd wait, watch, plan. When the time came, they'd both feel the weight of what they'd done, and I'd make sure it was on my terms. I had known about Lena's affair with Troy Benson for weeks, and keeping it to myself was tearing me apart inside, a slow unraveling I couldn't stop. Every morning, I watched her pour coffee into my mug, her hand steady, her voice light as she asked about my plans for the farm, and every evening, I listened to her hum while she cooked dinner, pretending everything was normal between us. But it wasn't normal, not for me. I had seen the footage from the barn camera, the one I'd installed to keep an eye on the equipment, and there they were, tangled together on a hay bale like I didn't exist. I didn't say anything at first because I needed time to process it, to figure out what I was going to do with the jagged mess of emotions lodged in my chest. That all changed the night of the fall harvest fair, when the pressure built up too high and I couldn't hold it back anymore. The fair was the kind of event our small town lived for, a chaotic sprawl of lights and noise where everyone turned out to eat greasy food and pretend the world wasn't falling apart. Lena had been excited about it for days, going on about the roasted corn and the band they'd hired from the next county over, and she'd begged me to come along, saying it'd be a chance for us to relax together. I didn't want to go, but I agreed because I knew Troy would be there, strutting around like he owned the place, and I needed to see them together with my own eyes, not just on a grainy screen. We got to the fairgrounds as the sky turned dusky, the air thick with the smell of fried dough and wood smoke, and Lena was chattering beside me, pointing out the kids running around with cotton candy stuck to their faces. I barely heard her, my attention fixed on finding Troy in the crowd, and it didn't take long. He was near the ticket booth, grinning and handing out flyers for his marketing firm, looking every bit the polished outsider he was. "Hey, Owen, Lena. You guys made it," Troy called out when he spotted us, waving us over with that easy confidence that made my stomach twist. Lena smiled back at him, her steps quickening as she pulled me along, and I followed, my jaw tight, my hands shoved deep in my pockets. He stuck out his hand, and I shook it, feeling the warmth of his palm against mine, wondering how many times it had touched her in ways I didn't want to imagine. Lena stood close to me, her shoulder brushing mine, acting like we were still the perfect couple everyone thought we were, and it took everything in me not to pull away right then. "Good to see you too, Troy," I said, keeping my voice level, my eyes locked on his. "Heard you're doing big things tonight. Sponsoring something, right?" He nodded, glancing at Lena before answering. "Yeah, got a booth set up for the firm. It's all about getting out there, meeting people, building trust. I've actually got some thoughts for your farm, Owen, new angles we could try. We should sit down sometime." "Sounds good," I replied, my tone flat. "I'm sure you've got plenty of ideas." Lena squeezed my arm, her fingers pressing into me. "Troy's been telling me about this campaign he's working on. It's smart, could really help us out, don't you think?" I turned to her, my gaze sharpening. "Oh, he's been telling you a lot, has he? You two must be spending some real quality time together." She hesitated, her smile slipping just enough for me to notice. "It's just for the video stuff, Owen. You know that. Business, that's all." I didn't say anything, letting her words hang there, watching her squirm under the weight of them. Troy shifted his weight, clearing his throat like he could sense the air thickening. Well, I'd better check on the booth. You two have fun, I'll see you around. He walked off, disappearing into the crowd, and Lena tugged at me, her voice bright again. Let's go get some food. I'm dying for those cider donuts. But I didn't budge. I stood there, staring at the spot where Troy had been, my pulse hammering in my ears, drowning out the fair's noise, the clatter of rides, the shots of vendors, all of it fading until it was just me and the truth I couldn't ignore anymore. I couldn't keep playing along, acting like I didn't know what she'd done. Lena, I said, my voice quiet but firm. We've got to talk. Now. She looked up at me, frowning, her head tilting slightly. What's going on? You've been off since we got here. I took a long breath, steadying myself. I know about you and Troy. Her eyes widened, and for a second, she didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at me like she hadn't heard right. Then she laughed, a shaky sound that didn't reach her eyes. What? Owen, that's ridiculous. There's nothing going on. Don't, I said, my voice cutting through hers. I saw you. On the camera. In the barn. Her face crumpled, the color leaching out of it, and she opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Owen, listen, it's not what you're thinking. It was nothing. A stupid mistake, that's all. A mistake? I repeated, my anger flaring hot and fast. You're telling me you accidentally ended up with him in our barn, on the hay bale where we used to talk about our future? She flinched, her hands shaking as she reached for me. I was lonely, okay? You're always so busy with the farm, and I messed up. It didn't mean anything, I promise. I stepped back, dodging her touch. Lonely doesn't give you the right to do that. You lied to me, Lena. Every day, you looked me in the eye and lied. Tears started rolling down her face, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I didn't want this. It happened once, and I hated myself for it. I love you, Owen. You have to believe me. Don't tell me what I have to believe, I snapped, my control slipping. You made a choice. You picked him, and you threw us away like it was nothing. She shook her head, sobbing now. No, I didn't pick him. I was confused, and I screwed up, but I want us. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I stared at her, the woman I'd built my life with, and all I could see was the gap between who I thought she was and what she'd done. My chest hurt, a deep, steady ache, but my mind was clear. I don't know if there's anything left to make right. Not after this. Her breath hitched, her hand covering her mouth. Please don't say that. We can get through it. I'll prove it to you, just don't give up on me. I turned away, the fair spinning around us, people laughing and eating and living their lives while mine fell apart. I need space, I said, my voice low. I need to figure out what I'm doing. She nodded, wiping her face, her words trembling. Okay. I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll be here. I walked off, leaving her standing there, the distance between us growing with every step. I didn't know if I'd go back, if I could ever look at her without seeing Troy's hands on her. The fair carried on, loud and bright, but I felt like I was moving through a void, trying to find my footing in a world that didn't make sense anymore. After the confrontation at the fair, I realized I couldn't let Lena and Troy walk away from what they'd done without facing some kind of reckoning. Their betrayal had turned my world upside down, but I wasn't about to let my emotions take over and drive me into doing something rash or loud. That wasn't who I was. Instead, I decided to use the hurt and anger boiling inside me to fuel a plan, something deliberate, something that would hit them where it mattered most and still leave me standing tall. The farm had always been my backbone, the one thing I could count on, and now it was going to be the tool I'd use to make them pay. I'd been kicking around an idea for a while about starting a co-branded fertilizer line tied to the farm's name, a project that could put us on the map and give us an edge over the other local operations. It wasn't something I'd pushed forward before, but with everything falling apart around me, it felt like the perfect time to get it going. Troy's marketing skills could make it work, and even though being near him made my stomach turn, I knew I had to keep him close for this to play out the way I wanted. I needed him to think I was still clueless about the affair, to keep him off guard while I set things in motion. I picked up the phone and called Troy, setting up a meeting at the farm to talk business. When he showed up, he had this twitchy look about him, like he was waiting for me to bring up what happened at the fair. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I laid out my plans for the fertilizer line, explaining how his firm could handle the branding and get it out to the right people. He jumped on it, probably relieved I wasn't digging into anything personal, and agreed to take the project on. Over the next few weeks, we worked together, hammering out the details and getting everything lined up for the launch. I kept careful records of every step, every conversation, every email, every handshake, just in case I needed to cover myself down the road. Troy thought we were partners in this, but I had other plans brewing. While we were sorting out the fertilizer deal, I'd been quietly piecing together more proof of what Lena and Troy had been up to behind my back. I had extra footage from the barn camera, plus some emails and texts I'd managed to pull together without them knowing. I didn't wave any of it in their faces or make a big show of it. I just held on to it, biding my time until I could use it right. That chance came when I got an invite to speak at the statewide farming cooperative's annual meeting. They were on the hunt for a new voice to represent their push for sustainability and community values, and I saw it as the opening I'd been waiting for, a way to lift up the farm and deal with the mess in my personal life all at once. I spent days working on my speech, focusing on what integrity meant in our line of work, how trust was the glue that held everything together, whether it was between farmers, suppliers, or the people closest to you. I didn't spell out the affair for the crowd, but I didn't need to. The point came through loud and clear to anyone listening close enough. I talked about how dishonesty could rip apart the bonds we relied on, how it could spoil the ground we all shared. When I stepped up to that podium and looked out at the room, I saw heads nodding, faces tightening with understanding. Afterward, a handful of folks from the cooperative came over, gripping my hand, telling me how much they appreciated what I'd said. It felt like I was finally getting a grip on things, like I was steering this ship again. That night, I sat down at my desk and put together an anonymous email. I attached the barn camera footage, the emails, the texts, everything I'd collected, and sent it off to the cooperative's leadership, along with some key players in the local farming circles and the church email list. I knew hitting send would set off a chain reaction I couldn't stop, that it would drag Lena and Troy into the light and force them to answer for what they'd done. But it was the only way I could see to move past this, to clear the air and start putting my life back together. When I clicked that button, it was like a load slipped off my back. I'd taken charge of this mess, and now it was up to the world to do what it would with the truth. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glow of the screen, and for the first time in weeks, I let a small grin creep across my face. Lena and Troy had figured they could pull one over on me, but they'd misjudged who they were dealing with. They were about to find out that in a place like this, where everybody knows everybody, your name is all you've got, and I was going to make sure theirs took the hit it deserved. The news about Lena and Troy spread through town faster than I'd expected. People couldn't keep quiet about it, and before long, I couldn't go anywhere without someone bringing it up. At the feed store, folks would pat me on the shoulder and mumble something about how they were sorry, while at church, the pastor kept checking in, asking how I was holding up. I didn't mind the support, but I wasn't in the mood to talk about it with anyone. I just wanted space to think, to figure out what was left of my life now that everything had fallen apart. Lena didn't pack up and leave right away, which surprised me at first, though I wasn't sure why I expected anything different. She stayed in the house, keeping to the guest room, moving around me like she was afraid to make too much noise. We barely spoke. There wasn't much left to say after the confrontation at the fair and the revenge I'd taken by letting everyone see the truth. She tried apologizing over and over in those first few days, but I'd stopped listening because the words didn't mean anything anymore. The anger I'd felt had faded into something else, a deep exhaustion that settled into my bones, making it hard to care about fighting or fixing things. I knew we couldn't go on like this, stuck in this strange in-between where we were still under the same roof but miles apart. One night, after I'd spent the day working the fields until my hands ached, I walked into the kitchen and saw Lena sitting at the table, holding a mug of tea that had probably gone cold. She looked up at me, her eyes puffy and red, like she'd been crying for a while. I didn't ask what was wrong, it was obvious enough. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, letting the silence hang there until she finally broke it, her voice trembling. "I'm leaving tomorrow. I found a place in Billings with my sister." I nodded, taking it in without much reaction because I'd seen this coming for a while. You think that's the right move? She gripped the mug tighter, her knuckles turning white. I don't know what's right anymore, Owen. But I can't stay here, not with things the way they are. Every time I'm around you, I feel how much I've ruined everything, and it's too much. I need to get out, for me and for you. I leaned back, looking at her across the table, trying to recognize the woman I'd married in the person sitting there now. It was hard to see her the way I used to, before all this happened. What about us, Lena? What happens next? She hesitated, her lip quivering as tears started forming again. I keep hoping there's a way to make this work, but I don't think you want that. And I get it, I don't deserve for you to want it. I didn't answer right away because I'd been wrestling with that same question for weeks, wondering if there was anything worth salvaging between us. There were moments when I thought about trying, about seeing if we could start over, but then I'd remember the footage, the lies, the way she'd looked at Troy, and it all fell apart again. I don't think I can do it, I said, keeping my tone even. There's too much that's broken. I can't be around you without thinking about what happened. She nodded, brushing tears away with her sleeve. I'll sign whatever you need for the divorce. I won't make it harder than it has to be. Hearing her say divorce out loud hit me differently than I expected. It was final, but it also felt like a relief, like I could finally stop holding my breath. We'll keep it straightforward, I said. Split everything evenly, no arguing over it. No arguing, she repeated softly, almost to herself. I'm sorry, Owen. For all of it. I didn't respond to that because I'd heard it too many times already, and it didn't change anything. I got up and walked to the window, staring out at the farm stretching into the darkness, the one thing that hadn't let me down. I used to think this was something we'd share forever, you know, this place, this life. Now it's just mine again, and maybe that's how it's supposed to be. She didn't say anything back, and when I turned around, she was still sitting there, staring into her mug like it held some kind of answer. We stayed like that for a while, the quiet filling the room until she stood up, rinsed the mug, and started toward the guest room. She stopped at the doorway, looking back at me. I did love you, Owen. I still do, even after everything I've done. I held her gaze, not letting my expression give anything away. Maybe you did. But it wasn't enough, was it? She shook her head, tears falling freely now, and then she left, the door clicking shut behind her. I sat there for a long time after, letting it all settle in my mind, the end of us, the start of something else. The next morning, I watched from the porch as she packed her car and drove off, the gravel crunching under her tires until she was out of sight. I didn't feel torn up about it, just calm, like I'd finally closed a chapter I'd been stuck in too long. Over the next few days, I got back to work on the farm, putting in long hours that left me tired but focused, the routine keeping me steady. I didn't dwell on Lena much, and when I did, it was with a sense of distance, like looking back at something that didn't belong to me anymore. The cooperative started reaching out more, asking me to speak at meetings or help out the new farmers, and I said yes every time because it gave me something to build toward. Standing in the fields one night, watching the sky turn dark, I realized I'd come through this different, stronger, maybe, or at least more sure of what I could handle. The betrayal had shaken me, but it had also shown me I didn't need to hold on to what was gone, I could let it go and keep going. Reflecting on everything that has unfolded over the past few months, I find it hard to believe how much my life has shifted since that day I discovered Lena and Troy together, turning everything I thought I knew upside down. Back then, the sting of their betrayal consumed me, leaving me questioning how I had been so blind to what was happening right under my nose, and I spent countless evenings alone in the barn, sorting through my thoughts while the world outside carried on without me. As time passed, though, I began to see that what felt like a collapse was actually a chance to rebuild, to carve out a version of myself I hadn't known I could become, shaped by the hard lessons I was forced to learn along the way. The farm, which had always been my steady ground, became more than just a place to work. It turned into a proving ground where I tested my limits and found out what I was capable of carrying on my own shoulders. After Lena packed up and left, I doubled down on the farm, pouring every ounce of energy into keeping it running smoothly, waking up long before dawn to tend the crops and staying out in the fields until the stars were the only light left to guide me back to the house. The physical labor was exhausting, but it gave me a focus that pulled me out of the haze of anger and confusion, and I started noticing how the cooperative began turning to me for more than just my harvest yields. They wanted my input, my ideas, my voice. They asked me to lead discussions at their meetings, to share what I knew with the newer members who were still finding their footing, and I took on those roles without hesitation, finding a strange comfort in being useful to someone else. It wasn't long before I realized that the farm wasn't just sustaining me, it was giving me a way to connect, to matter beyond the boundaries of my own land. One day, while I was out repairing a section of irrigation pipe that had been leaking for weeks, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked up to see a pickup rolling toward the house, dust trailing behind it in the dry afternoon air. A man I didn't know climbed out, carrying a notebook, and he waved as I walked over to meet him. "Owen Rourke," he called out, adjusting his cap as he squinted into the sunlight. "That's right," I replied, brushing dirt off my hands before offering one to shake. "What brings you out here?" He explained he was from a company in Helena, one that dealt with agricultural outreach, and they'd caught wind of how I'd been steering the cooperative through some rough patches lately. They were putting together a program to promote better farming practices across the region, and they wanted me to be part of it, leading workshops, talking to groups, maybe even putting my name on some materials they'd distribute statewide. I stood there listening as he outlined what they had in mind, and though it was a lot to take in, I could feel a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense that I could step into a bigger role and handle it. When he drove off, I lingered by the gate, turning the conversation over in my head, and I knew I'd say yes, not just for the farm, but for myself. A week or so later, I found an envelope in the mailbox with Lena's handwriting on it, postmarked from her new place a few towns over, and I hesitated before opening it, unsure what I'd find inside after so much silence between us. Her note was brief, saying she'd settled into a job at a clinic and was trying to make a fresh start, and she ended it by wishing me well, nothing more than that, no excuses, no pleas, just a quiet update. I read it through twice, then set it aside on the kitchen table, feeling no urge to respond or dig back into what we'd left behind, because that part of my life had faded into something distant, like a road I'd traveled once but wouldn't walk again. With the farm running stronger than ever, I started opening it up to others, inviting folks from the cooperative to come learn about the methods I'd been refining, showing them how to keep their operations lean and steady through unpredictable seasons. Teaching wasn't something I'd ever pictured myself doing, but I found I liked it, standing there in the barn, explaining soil management or equipment upkeep, watching people nod as they took notes, knowing I was passing on something that could make their lives a little easier. It hit me one afternoon, as I was walking the rows of corn with a group trailing behind me, that I'd built a life I could stand tall in, one that didn't buckle under the weight of what had happened before. Late one evening, after everyone had gone home, I stayed out by the edge of the property, looking over the fields as the last light slipped away and the air cooled around me. I thought about how far I'd come, how the hurt from Lena and Troy had lit a fire under me, driving me to push harder, to reach further, until I landed somewhere I never expected, respected, relied upon, and ready for whatever lay ahead. The farm stretched out in front of me, quiet and solid, and I knew it wasn't just the land that had held up through everything, it was me, too, shaped by the choices I'd made and the strength I'd found along the way.